Cities are an ever-present force in all kinds of media. Films, TV shows, books, games, you name it. However, there are times when these media and art forms take their depiction of cities a step further, to the point where the city is almost a character in and of itself. Los Angeles in Blade Runner and Nightcrawler, respectively, Gotham in The Batman, and Rapture in BioShock are all excellent examples of this. But the best example that stands out to me is found in Night City, the setting of CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077. For anyone who may not know, the game itself is based on a tabletop RPG from the 80s, Cyberpunk 2020. Night City acts as the sole setting for all campaigns within the game, resulting in it being exceptionally fleshed out, and same goes for the broader lore of the world surrounding it. This, in turn, gave CD Projekt Red some 40 years of world building and history to go off of when bringing Night City into the 3D realm, and it shows. In Cyberpunk 2077, you explore the city as a mercenary, V, with a time limit on their life, all while the oppressive and unforgiving nature of the dystopian Night City plays its own role in the story and begins to truly feel alive, gaining its own sense of characterization. In knowing all of this, and with the preface that I am by no means an expert in urban planning or design, I want to explore the areas of Night City's development and history that are similar to how our own cities develop, the effectiveness of the urban issues highlighted within Night City, and what it is the city itself is saying about urban life and who the city is meant for. Night City began as billionaire Richard Knight's pet project, who saw the coming collapse of the United States as the world knew it, and wanted to create something akin to an insular capitalist utopia. How very, would you kindly of him. Of course, this isn't really how things played out. Knight attempted to shut out corrupt mob-run unions in favor of independent contractors and investors, which in turn led to Richard Knight's assassination, and the subsequent renaming of the city in his honor. Then, in this power vacuum, the mob and the corporations vied for control of the city and how it would develop, with the corporations ultimately coming out on top. This in turn led to a short-lived, peaceful era, which ultimately progressed into a late-stage capitalist dystopia, with corporations and private industry controlling most facets of life. This of course meant things like gentrification and displacement took place in excess, with one of the quote, best examples of this being found in the town of Laguna Bend, a once thriving community that was ultimately flooded and sunk to become a reservoir in 2062. This also happens to be the town one of the side characters, Judy, grew up in.
Impressive, huh? That's incredible. What is it? Our very own Atlantis. It used to be called Laguna Bend. Just 15 years ago, people still lived here. Yeah, I remember. NC Dam Limited made plans to build a dam. People protested, and the rest is history. Houses, playgrounds, all flooded. Got some connection to this place, right? You got it. Grew up here. Haven't been back since Laguna Bend was wiped off the map.
The corporation developed temporary housing to move some of the residents out of the area, but many stayed and ultimately became victims of the Corp's subsequent smear campaign. This campaign turned public opinion against them and allowed the rest of the city to turn a blind eye to the heightened police violence and tactics used against them. The residents protested to no avail until the corporation finally decided to begin destruction of the houses, with families still living in them, resulting in an incident that killed one such family. This marked the end for many of the residents, and slowly all of them left, with the last few stragglers being dragged out of their homes by the Night City police.
You knew the owner. One of our neighbors was hell-bent on staying in Laguna Bend. Badges literally dragged him out of his house before the water came in. So he built himself another house as close as he possibly could, but then he got sick. Water was way more toxic back then.
The story of Laguna Bend mirrors that of the real-life Latino community of Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles, in which the community was ultimately displaced and destroyed, and it's now where Dodger Stadium stands today. Just like Laguna Bend, Chavez Ravine suffered from a smear campaign from private industry. The original plan was to replace Chavez Ravine with public housing, but of course by the time all the residents lost their homes, private industry did its thing, intervened, and proposed Dodger Stadium instead.
I remember looking at my house. I knew I wasn't going to see it again. I just looked at it once and I refused to look at it again because I knew I was going to break down. And my mother was already all broken. And she needed somebody to be strong for her. My father built that house. I was born there. It had a vine growing, and it covered all the roof in the front. And in spring, it looked like it was wearing a white crown. So we moved away. It was gone. And you know, I've never felt about any other house the way I felt about that one.
Both the fictional Laguna Bend and the real Chavez Ravines communities ultimately had the state and private industry force them out of their homes and replace their communities with whatever served these institutions' best interests. And both serve as an example of a story that is all too common in the development of real-life American cities as we know them today. Now, in 2077, when the game actually takes place, Night City is essentially its own city-state and sold as a thriving multicultural hub of capitalist trade. In reality, for the average person, it's a capitalist dystopia with massive income inequality, poverty, high crime rates, corporate control over most all facets of life, and organized crime and gangs running different districts of the city. Chances are, if you aren't working for a corp directly or indirectly, you're either a criminal, a mercenary, or homeless. These seem to be the main urban issues the game represents, as they highlight themselves through both the dressing of the world itself and are felt through certain narratives in the game. The city itself sports Blade Runner-esque neon advertisements in the sky, as well as billboards and advertisements everywhere, including ads for things like real water. That's cool. Things like gang violence, pollution, police shootouts, and victims of crime being left to die on the street because they don't have health insurance are everyday occurrences. All of this is juxtaposed to the pristine corporate plaza area of the city, which is clean and mostly crime-free, since this is of course where all the people who really run the city reside and work. Which honestly isn't too different from how a lot of the business districts of certain cities seem to appear as well. All of this creates a strange dichotomy between the impoverished and wealthy parts of the city, as well as the staggering misuse of the amazing and sometimes miraculous technology that exists alongside it all. But hey, I mean, good thing that our cities in real life aren't designed like that, right? Like, right? Narratively, these urban issues are more so felt rather than preached about directly, with many of the game's side quests giving glimpses into the desperate, violent, and exploited or exploitative lives the people of Night City are leading. The prevailing feeling you're often left with is that of either people desperately trying to get by, or people suffering / making others suffer under their thumb, with happy endings being almost non-existent. So this point about the narrative actually draws some similarities to Engel's observations of London in The Great Towns. Particularly the passage, "The social war, the war of each against all, is here openly declared. People regard each other only as useful objects. Each exploits the other, and the end of it all is that the stronger treads the weaker underfoot, and that the powerful few, the capitalists, seize everything for themselves, while to the weak many, the poor, scarcely a bare existence remains." This quote sums up the general feeling you get from existing in this digital city, as no matter where you're exploring in the game, you're faced with the bare existence of the average citizen with their limited options in life, often seeing them become victims or victimizers themselves. Meanwhile, the player character, V, is almost always in conflict with the major corporations, capitalists, of Night City, with the megacorp Arasaka being the main villain of the main story. The surface-level representation of urban issues is well executed in Night City, but in order to deeply explore them, one has to be willing to dig into things like various side quests, text entries, and the lore of the Cyberpunk IP itself. That being said, Cyberpunk 2077 on its own still allows the player to have various moments of reflection on urban issues, and allows them to contemplate where our own world might stand in comparison. By now, it seems clear Night City isn't really a place for your average person, but rather the average person is simply a cog that keeps the city running. Vessels meant to consume or be consumed, not to be cared for. In an article for Volume magazine discussing the concept of smooth cities, architect René Boer states, "Neoliberal urbanism has given rise to the post-political city, in which the urban has increasingly become a commodity and urban politics are deliberately undermined in favor of technocratic economic measures. Its inhabitants are treated as consumers rather than citizens, who also need to work increasingly efficiently, which fuels the demand for smooth, friction-free urban spaces." While Night City is by no means smooth or friction-free, it is certainly a city in which the urban is a commodity itself. Its brutalist architecture and nonsensical layout convey the idea that megacorps seemingly just place their buildings wherever is most convenient for them, with no regard or respect for the effect it'll have on other inhabitants. And shout out to this article, which goes way more in depth about that whole point I just made. Now, I wouldn't quite call Night City technocratic, a term which Boyer uses in this article, as it is, at its essence, more of a corporatocracy. As Night City's status as a free city with no ties to any state or country, allegedly, is one of the main reasons megacorps run the city and control whatever small semblance of a government the city has, to the point that you have powerful megacorp employees sitting on the city council. Boer's most potent point here, though, was the notion of a city's people becoming consumers rather than citizens. Basically everything about Night City's late-stage capitalism aesthetic, culture, and design makes it clear that the priority is to make this a place of rampant consumerism and desperate escapism. So long as these escapist activities also generate revenue, of course. Nothing else is given priority or care except for those who are on top of the corporate ladder. For all of its multiculturalism and technological marvels, Night City clearly isn't really meant for your average person. Instead, it barely tolerates them for the sake of their wallets and the labor they provide. Even a well-off megacorp employee is subject to a life of overwork and servitude. That fact alone draws real-life comparisons to something like the tech bros of Silicon Valley, who I don't exactly have a ton of sympathy for, and they make tons of money, sure. But even these guys are often overworked to shit and can lose their livelihoods at the drop of a hat. I mean, just look at Elon Musk's Twitter takeover and the absolute mess that was on its own. Or even how companies like Tesla, SpaceX, Meta, and Google are more than willing to kick their employees to the curb if it means better profit margins for the quarter. And, a litany of other issues with those companies, but for the sake of the video, I'll stay focused. Whether it's Night City or real-life America, only the people at the very top of corporations get to experience a life of relative freedom, while everyone else is left attempting to exist in their respective oppressive landscapes. Night City and the cyberpunk genre as a whole mainly act as a warning as to what may await our cities in the future. Mike Pondsmith, the creator of the Cyberpunk tabletop, has said as much himself. So much of what makes up the city is either inspired directly from real-life parallels like Laguna Bend, or acts as an exaggeration of the problems of modern city life. More than anything, Cyberpunk 2077's depiction of the future of urban life is a bit of a hopeless one. The recurring theme being that Night City is the wrong place for any kind of happy or fair ending, and both the narrative and world-building elements of the game constantly reinforce this. Even in regards to the story of V, the endings a player can get are all bittersweet at best. However, it's important to remember that while the problems Night City dramatizes are very real, and some elements of the future pictured here are a genuine possibility, at the end of the day, this is a piece of entertainment. That is to say, we should be careful not to allow depictions like this to discourage us from believing in a better future for our cities and society as a whole. The one parallel Night City fails to draw from or tap into all that much is the campaigns and efforts by real people and activists who try to shift the trajectory of our cities into places that actually care about the people living in them. As mentioned, the average NC citizen is basically left with the options of worker drone, mercenary, homeless, or leave the city altogether, and any semblance of grassroots movements or groups trying to implement societal change in general are depicted as largely hopeless by the game's narrative. Which is fine, the game's supposed to be a dystopia, so I get it. But in real life, while it may feel like it at times, our options aren't nearly as limited. For starters, and I know it may sound a bit basic and corny, but you can become an informed voter in your local elections. Emphasis on the informed bit. And granted, this is kind of US-centric, and while I understand some folks' nihilism when it comes to the power of their vote, I'd say local elections are not nearly at the dystopian state that they are in Night City. If anything, they're where you can see the most material change happen in your community as a direct result of your vote. Just getting involved in your city or town's local political scene in general is a great start. Whether it's voting in local elections, showing up to city council meetings, or even just volunteering at a food kitchen and getting to know your community a bit more, all of these make up the mechanisms of change for your community. It may not always be an immediate change, but it's positive change nonetheless. And hey, if you're wanting something that feels a bit more impactful in the moment, or at the very least like a directed group effort, find some activist groups in your area, especially if you're in or near a city, you definitely have some around. If you don't know where to start looking, this site is a good source to at least give you some general, bigger picture organizations to start with. And beyond that, honestly just Googling your town and insert desired subject, organization, is as good a place to start as any. I won't try and derail too much here, but I'll link even more resources down below for anyone who feels stuck on where to start, because I know that can be the biggest hurdle sometimes. With numerous mutual aid efforts, affordable housing initiatives, the revitalized interest in 15-minute cities, anti-gentrification efforts, and many other organizations or movements on the rise, there are so many ways for people to contribute to positive change in their cities and society at large. You just have to be willing to put the time and effort in. It can be easy to let these thoughts of political or community-based action just kind of start and stop here in the online sphere. But all I ask is that you try, even in some small way, to let those thoughts follow you out into the real world for a bit. Maybe you give up 1 day a month, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, just find what works for you. It's hard to get started, that's for sure. I myself struggle with the same thing and am frankly not as consistent with mutual aid as I'd like to be, so I get it. If anything, this video is a call to action for myself, just as much as it is for anyone watching. But yeah, even thinking about doing stuff like that can sound tiring, and I get it. Life is hard, depressing even. Meanwhile, even some of our means of escapism, like Cyberpunk 2077, are showcasing these issues in both warning us and asking us to reflect on these more depressing and dystopian aspects. However, rather than act as confirmation bias, the depressing moments of reflection that Night City offers should act as fuel to fight against the future it depicts, rather than accept its inevitability.